Is Nefer a terrible beginner pull? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So, of course, we've got a new character coming up, and I'm looking into different aspects of them, and now we have to ask the question of whether Nefer's a good beginner pull or not. But because I've already talked down about her so much in terms of her non-free-to-play friendliness, I feel like this question is pretty self-explanatory. I think the short answer is that if you literally don't have anything else on your account right now, yeah, she's just not going to be a good beginner pull. She's not really going to be the type of character where you can pull for her, slap together a team using whatever you've got, and be able to clear super duper well later on. It's not really going to feel that good. Now, I will say that the game does still give you some tools so that you could still build a free-to-play team for her if all you're looking for is just to generally clear content. She is a Bloom DPS, and you get characters like Kale and Barbara and Ino and such for free. So don't worry if your issue is just having anybody to use with her in the overworld. If you're somebody that likes to build teams correctly in the overworld, you will still be able to do that, and you're still going to have options that will be able to carry you throughout most of the game. That's not going to be a problem whatsoever. Also, Dendro ends up being really good at shield breaking most of the time, so you're not really going to have to worry about elemental shields either. The only time that's going to really be a nuisance to you is perhaps cryo shields, but otherwise you're generally going to be fine. When it comes to Nefer's beginner value, I have to ask, how new are you? Because if you were around in 6.0 and you were able to pick up Lauma, then suddenly Nefer ends up being a really good pull for you, because then you're able to form a very strong Lunar Bloom team, and all's well that ends well. But if you weren't around for Lauma, then picking up Nefer becomes a lot more questionable. I think that the recent new DPSs that have been coming out have been debatable beginner pulls, simply because the majority of them do want some of her 5-star in order to work at their absolute best. However, in Nefer's case, it is especially bad. Is there any way that you can at least remedy this a little bit? Yes, there is. I wouldn't say that it's as good as Flynn's situation, but I would still say that it is a solution if you really want Nefer as your first 5-star. If you're starting out, you're going to have a ton of Primo Gems that you're going to be able to farm across the map, and with that in mind, get Nefer C1R1. If you get the baseline of her high investment, then she's going to feel a whole lot better than she would at base if you don't have Lauma. It's still definitely going to be rough, but if you insist on investing into Nefer specifically, then this is going to help you out, because otherwise, she's just not going to feel anywhere near as good. Now, if you did manage to pick up Lauma, well, good for you. This isn't really going to be a problem for you, and she's going to end up being a perfectly fine beginner pull. Obviously, she's still going to be on the more niche side, but all things considered, you're going to be building up quite a strong Lunar Bloom team, and you're going to have a good complete team pretty soon. It'll also likely be the current meta team for Bloom for ages to come. I can't really see Hoyoverse replacing this, especially because Dendro just has gotten such little attention over this past while, with the last Dendro unit we got being Kanich, and he didn't really have anything to do with Dendro cores, because he was a burning unit. So this is the first real sense of attention that Dendro cores have gotten in a hot minute. So, with that in mind, if that's something that interests you, then yes, Nefer's gonna be worthwhile. But all around, from looking at this from an objective perspective, I think that there are definitely better DPSs that you can pull for as a beginner. However, I think something that's worth taking into consideration is that a lot of DPSs these days do want some of her character in order to work at their best. At some stage, we are going to have to start changing our standards as to what is friendly to get and what is unfriendly to get, because it does seem like this is the general direction that Hoyoverse is going in. And previously, I said that this was the case for the past 3 DPSs, but it wasn't as bad for Flynn's, because you could still circumvent it in some ways. But to be honest, if we want to push this to its limits, you could argue that most DPSs that we're getting in general through the past year have generally really wanted a specific teammate. There are obviously exceptions like Mualani and Chaska. Those two have generally been able to get by just using kind of whatever, because that pair of characters have a very flexible team. However, if we take a look at Moika, whenever she was coming out, we considered her the most restrictive Archon. Eonson didn't exist yet, and you basically needed Shilonen in order to attain her top performance. And that's the best DPS in the game currently, so I would say that that's pretty impactful. And there's also Kanich who really wanted Emily, but at least in Kanich's case you could justify it by saying, yes, but he is definitely more of a niche carry that fills a very specific type of damage type, so because of that, it makes sense that his own team is more niche. But in Moika's case, no, she is just on the more restrictive end. Now, obviously, she's not really a restrictive character on the whole because of how many teams that you're able to use her in. I'm not calling her a restrictive unit. I'm just saying that her absolute best in slot team whenever she first launched was pretty rigid. And it's absolutely nowhere near as bad as what's happening right now. I'm not saying that. I'm more so just pointing out that at some stage, I think it's just gonna have to become a given that if you want a specific DPS to perform, you're gonna need to pull for their dedicated support. And to be fair, it used to not really be like this, and I do think that Genshin has still retained the general spirit of making sure that whenever you pull for support, they're never really only going to be good for just one character. That is rarely ever the case. Escoffier is basically needed in order for Skirk to truly perform. However, Escoffier still ends up being a really high value pull independent of Skirk because she just has so many other teams that she's able to work with within her niche, and she revived the entire existence of the cryo element within the meta, and I think that's pretty substantial if you were there and you know what position that element was in before. So, whenever you consider all of that, it's not all doom and gloom. However, it's undeniable that this is definitely just gonna be the future from here on. So whenever it comes to evaluating whether a character is gonna be a good beginner pull and they're a main DPS and they're a newer one, and it's pretty obvious that they're not gonna be as good if you don't get their XYZ support, if you don't put 2 and 2 together, then I think the most natural thing that you can usually do is get the character C1, because from what I'm seeing, that generally seems to be the best solution to this problem that you're likely going to be able to universally apply. Now yes, it didn't really save Skirk in her case, but she, in my opinion, has the absolute worst case of this. She is so cost inefficient. Yes, Skirk is ridiculously strong, but in terms of cost, you need to put in so much with her. Now, in Nefer's case, I do think that the case is bad, but I still think that you can at least make it work for yourself. She has a craftable weapon, so if you're starting out and you basically don't have any weapons, that's not really going to be an issue for you. Make sure that you get her C1 if you can and you don't have Llama. I do think that if you do have a Deer Lady, then you don't necessarily need the C1. And here's the thing, you might not even need the C1 if you just want to simply play her and you don't really mind what her performance is, like that's fine. But if you want her performance to be anything good, then I would suggest that you invest just that little bit extra to compensate for having the lack of her limited 5-star teammate. I don't really think that it's going to save her the way that it saved Flynn's, but it sure as heck is going to help, especially because nowadays, the quality of constellations is just ridiculously high. And here's the thing, if you do get Nefer C1 now, and then down the line you end up pulling for characters like Columbina, who I personally expect to be the big Nodcry main character, who will be responsible for making all of your Nodcry units absolutely busted, that's gonna be one thing. And then if you pick up Llama on rerun, you're gonna be rewarded with an extremely strong team, because that's something else that you should consider. While teams are becoming more expensive at a baseline, yes, the high investment for teams is really improving. Like, C1s these days are genuinely impressive. Okay, they've always been pretty good, and some characters have had particularly impressive C1s, but in this case, I see that recently they've just been going up and up in quality, and it's generally just becoming more worth getting them. There was a time where C2 was generally the big benchmark constellation, and it still is. C2 usually is still the one that provides the biggest increase of them all, early on in investment. Obviously C6 is going to be a bigger jump than that, but I mean early on, and what I mean by that is from C1 to C3. Anything above that, then you're likely going for C6, or you just somehow managed to land a C4 on a character, which I don't even know how that happened. Who knows, maybe you just got really lucky and got 5 5-stars in one 10 pull, in which case, congratulations, you truly are lucky. That aside, I think the question of is Nefer a beginner-friendly pull is just stupid, because we know the answer is no, so it's honestly just better to look at what can we do to make her better for a beginner, because the situation isn't going to be that there's someone out there that's going to pull or not pull Nefer strictly just based on value. If you have a baseline interest in the character, it's likely because of her design or her story, or there's just something about her that you personally like, hence why you're wondering, can I use her if I don't really have that much? And if that's what you're wondering, there are ways to make it work, and there is always going to be a way to make it work. And I will say that while Nodcry units are relevant, Hoyoverse is definitely going to make bosses that shield these characters that is going to make your time easier. Those bosses aren't always going to be in rotation, obviously, but at least for the year of Nodcry, you can always be assured that your Nefer or just any Nodcry character that you pull for is going to be relevant for at least some time, because they will be shielded for a bit. I'm not talking about their initial period where they get Mega Shield, I'm more so talking about the introduction of bosses that cater to their mechanics that would regularly come back into rotation. That is something that happens frequently. So, she will always have that edge of usefulness to you, and like I said, you can always invest a little bit more into her if you're willing to, if you really like this character. But that's why I say that if you're not a super big mega fan of her and you don't have Lauma, then there's just not really a point. Now if you do, like I said, there's not really a question about it. Yes, she's a great beginner pull, she completes your Lauma team, she's a really strong DPS, and she really revives Dendro. It's really cool. So, she is good to get if you have a premium team. If not, be willing to invest a bit more into her, and that's pretty much the situation. Hopefully this video was able to tell you whether Nefer is a good beginner pull or not. This has been Juice, signing out, and friendly reminder that she knows all of your secrets.